Welcome to Chapter 14 and your lecture regarding training muscles to become stronger. This chapter really explores the underlying rationale for strength training. We'll be discussing acute and chronic physiological adjustments as muscles become stronger with training, and we'll also be going over a lot of basic concepts in regards to strength training. So don't forget to make sure you read over the chapter objectives before you complete your studying for today. There are quite a few of them that we'll touch upon. The beginning of the chapter goes into the history and the early development of analyzing strength development. So if you want, you can take an opportunity to read that information in your chapter. A lot of these contraptions look a little scary, right? These are the examples of the late 19th century strength and exercise machines popularized by some Swedish exercise scientists. We won't focus a whole lot of time on that, though, in regards to our lecture for today. But we are going to be talking about the foundations for studying muscular strength. And it did start all the way back in ancient China, Japan, India, Greece, and Rome. We're all very interested in the inclusion of strength development programs as a part of training regimens for preparing men for warfare. So this is the concepts that we're beginning to discuss today really do hold a lot of prevalence in today's society in regards to appropriate competition. I guess you could compare that to today's modern day warfare. In regards to being the best. So we talk about the different objectives on this slide in regards to resistance training. One of the objectives might be who is the strongest. Typically those are solved by participation through some sort of weightlifting or a powerlifting competition. If you're interested in bodybuilding, this is typically where individuals look to maximize muscular development for aesthetic goals. Bodybuilders aren't so much interested in being the strongest as they are really looking like they're the strongest in terms of being aesthetically pleasing to the eye. Are you proportional? If we're worried about general fitness and health enhancement, then we follow the general principles for strength training. There might be opportunity for rehabilitation for injury or maybe from suffering from some sort of disease. So this would be considered participating in resistance training for the purposes of physical therapy. And then we're also looking at sport-specific resistance training in order to maximize your performance on the athletic pitch or in competition, whether it's on the Pee-wee baseball field or whether it's elite-level competitors participating in the Olympics. And then we also have resistance training for the purpose of understanding the structure and function of our muscle physiology. So a bunch of different resistance training and strength development purposes depending on what your goal is. So there are many terms and a lot of jargon in the area of resistance training, but there's some certain terms that are consistently appear in the research literature as well as the popular writings about resistance training methods and outcomes. You have a really good table listed for you in table 14.1 with these different terminologies. Before we get there, I want to talk about the three different types of muscle actions, and that's what you see here. The first one is concentric action. And this is the most common form of muscle action that occurs in dynamic activities where muscles shorten and produce tension through a certain range of motion. So if you're doing a dumbbell curl or a bicep curl, when you actually flex your arm and you're bringing that weight up to your shoulder, your bicep is actually shortening. That would be a representation or example of a concentric action. So now what I want you to think about then is returning that free weight down to your side, and what you're doing is an eccentric action with your bicep muscle within that same exercise. And this is when the external resistance exceeds the muscle force and the muscle has to lengthen as the tension develops. So again, when you're thinking about a bicep curl, when you bring that weight up to your shoulders and squeeze, that bicep muscle is first going through a concentric action and then followed by an eccentric action where the muscle is returning to its lengthened state. We also have a force that's applied on the muscle when there's actually no movement or change in the length. So, for example, when you're doing a wall sit, you're applying a lot of force to maintain that position without actually being able to be seated in a chair, but there is no change in the length of the muscle. So that's considered an isometric action, when a muscle generates force and attempts to shorten, but it cannot overcome external resistance. We also have a dynamic constant external resistance, which is when external weight or resistance remains constant throughout a specific movement. So you've got some good graphs here to help you understand the differences in regards to the concentric versus eccentric muscle action and an isometric or static movement. Remember, static means there's little movement taking place, if any at all. So what you see here on picture B is an immovable bar. This individual might actually be standing on a force plate to see the force generated from actually pulling on this bar with all of its possible might. And the arms going through that particular motion is actually, there's no muscle action taking place in regards to the change of the length of the muscles, but it is generating a force. And so that's a great example of an isometric muscle action that's taking place here. So how do we move when muscles move in terms of lengthening and shortening? A couple different ways that we can do that. And there's also ways that we can measure the force produced by the changes in the length of the muscles. So remember, muscular strength is the maximum muscle force or tension or torque provided according to the actual movement. We can do things like isometric muscle testing, where the muscle force is measured at a specific joint angle. So you can see an individual sitting on a taping table, and we have something called a cable tensiometer, where the individual is sitting with his knee, and he's going to extend it out, and they're going to measure that angle that's produced there. We also have something called a hand grip dynamometer. Remind me, I can show you that in class. Where you squeeze with your hand, and it measures the rate of force production that's present, and that is a general indicator of overall strength. We also have a back leg lift dynamometer. So you're actually standing on a platform, and very similar to the isometric reaction that you saw on this particular slide right here for picture B. You can see that this individual is pulling up with as much force as possible, only this chain will move to a certain degree to where you cannot pull and create any further force on this particular chain, and it will measure the rate of force production. There's also computer-assisted devices that are present in facilities that are able to afford those types of devices. There's different ways that we can measure the eccentric and concentric muscle strength tests, very commonly referred to as a 1 repetition maximum assessment or a 1 RM. Very, very common. So the results of this is a very close to your initial weight, but it's below your maximum capacity. And there's proper procedure to follow when performing a 1 RM test. What we do is obviously have to be very, very careful with our individuals that they've had some sort of training under the bar or within the particular exercise. So typically 1 RM tests will be done with a squat, will be done with a leg press, and also will be done with a bench press. And it's the absolute maximum amount of weight that someone can move in 1 repetition. Speed is not a priority. Speed is not measured in a 1 repetition max. It is simply the amount of weight moved. So the initial process is you kind of interview the client, see what they've done before, see if they've ever done a 1 repetition max test. And initially, the initial weight that actually goes on the bar, as an educated individual making your best educated decision with the input of the client, is to put whatever weight on there that's close to what they report, but I would definitely start below maximum capacity. You typically want to have them do 6 attempts for their 1 RM, no more, because after a certain point, they're not truly moving the maximum amount of weight because of fatigue involved. So the more sets you allow someone with just one, even just with 1 rep, you're risking fatigue. So it does need to be planned. It does need to be an assessment that's done on purpose and has been completely laid out and planned out before you even initiate. But the general concept is that the weight is progressively added onto subsequent attempts until the individual reaches their absolutely maximum lift capacity. Weight increments typically range between 1 to 5 kilograms, depending on the muscle groups tested. And your rest intervals, you typically want to have one attempt up to 2 to 3 minutes, maybe in 5 minutes of rest in between. And by the way, kilograms to pounds, for someone that's going to be in the weightlifting world, it is a good idea for you to understand the conversion between kilograms to pounds. Roughly speaking, kilograms are double of pounds, or pounds are double kilograms. So if you see someone that's moving 40 kilos on a bar, that means they're moving roughly 80 pounds of weight, and that's a rough estimate. But if you get into the weightlifting world, especially Olympic weightlifting, the competitors will actually report out. If you ask them, what's the most that you've ever squatted, or the most you've ever snatched, they'll answer you in kilos. There are other methods to assess, predict repetition maxes. A lot of individuals won't do a 1 RM test because it's not safe. Who really needs to do a 1 repetition max assessment? Maybe a professional, maybe elite level athlete. Everybody else, not so sure. So you can do prediction formulas based on a 5 repetition max assessment and also a 10 repetition max assessment. And that, again, just depends on who you're working with, why are you performing the test, why do you need to know that information. You can also do a simple prediction equation to calculate someone's predicted 1 repetition max. The two equations shown here for trained and untrained differ because previous resistance training actually alters the relationship between a submaximal performance and a maximal lift capacity. Generally, a weight one can lift for 7 to 10 repetitions represents about 68% of someone's 1 repetition max score for an untrained person, and usually it's about 79% of a new 1 RM after training. For example, if we were to estimate a 1 RM bench press score for a trained person whose 10 repetition max bench press equals 70 kilograms, we would perform an assessment that looks like this. We would take that 1.172 and multiply it by the 70 kilograms and then add in that 7.74 in order to get 89.7 kilograms. We can also use instrumentation such as computer-assisted electromechanical and isokinetic determinations through technology. So we use microprocessor technology integrated with strength equipment in order to quantify muscular force and power during specific muscular movements. So what you see here is a biodex, where you have an individual that's basically strapped into a chair, and it's hooked up to a software system that's on a computer located on a cart. And a clinician will come in, type in some variables, and then the computer system will actually start the machine that you see right here. It will do a countdown. The client will be able to see when the actual movement is going to begin to occur. And what happens with this particular dynamometer is there's electromechanical accommodating the resistance with a speed controlling mechanism, and it accelerates it to a preset constant velocity with applied force regardless of the force exerted on the arm movement itself. So these type of machines are very useful in rehabilitation purposes, physical therapy clinics, to see what power is present, maybe what power is lacking. A lot of times individuals that are having to go through physical therapy initially, pre, during, and post interventions, a therapist might put their client on this particular machine and test not only their injured limb but also their healthy limb to be able to see differences in the maximum force capabilities of each of the distal limbs. So some things that you need to consider prior to any sort of strength test that you may want to be doing. First, we need to understand the importance of standardizing instructions prior to testing. If you're working with an individual that has very little experience in the strength and resistance training world, there's going to be a lot of coaching, a lot of educating your clients before you even think about doing an assessment. Proper technique and safety always have to be key in regards to moving weight. So with that, there needs to be some sort of standardization of instructions prior to the testing, especially so that when you go back and retest that individual, you follow the same protocols each time so you can compare test results. You also want to make sure that there's a uniformity of the warm-up duration and intensity as to not get a skewed result and maybe get less power production than what somebody actually could if you hadn't maybe held an extra long warm-up. So I guess that's kind of a little bit part of when you standardize instructions prior to testing. Have a planned warm-up that you're going to do the same rate, the same intensity, the same amount of time prior to testing. You also want to give the client an opportunity to practice prior to testing. This helps minimize the learning effects that can be shown through improved strength. So adequate practice, number one, needs to be done mostly due to safety issues in regards to promoting proper technique. You also want to ensure consistency among the subjects in an angle of limb measurement and our body position of the testing device itself. So that just comes from proper planning and having a plan prior to putting someone on a piece of equipment or measuring, let's say, with a hand grip dynamometer. You also want to pre-plan and predetermine a minimum trial number, or these are considered our repetitions, so that we can establish a valid criterion strength score. As a clinician, we should select tests that have high score reproducibility. And we also need to recognize individual differences in body size and composition when actually evaluating strength scores. Training muscles to become stronger. So we understand the research has shown that muscles strengthen when they are trained at near max force generating capacity, and this is called our overload intensity, which provides that tension on the muscle. It's not a type of exercise, but it does determine overload and strength improvements subsequently upon recovery and repeated bouts of appropriate number of repetitions, sets, and rests according to the programming. So this kind of reminds us of our overload principle, that we need to tax our muscles in order to see adaptations that occur. Progressive resistance weight training, isometric training, and isokinetic training represents 3 common exercise systems to train muscles to become stronger. And so we're going to get into the next couple of slides that kind of go a little bit further into the differences between these types of methods. First, I want to remind you of our training principles we discussed from previous chapters in regards to overload or intensity for the muscles. So when we talk about setting or establishing intensity with cardiovascular activities, the way that we set intensity for resistance training activities is through loading the muscles by appropriate weight. And that means that muscles respond to an intensity of this overload rather than a complete overload mode. So the amount of overload that we place on the muscle reflects the percentage of the 1 RM of a non-fatigued muscle or group. And that's a purpose. That would be a reason why we would perform a 1 RM assessment, is determine what percentage we will work at. Obviously lower percentage that we will work at in our daily training in order to work up and to eventually increase our 1 repetition max score. The minimal intensity for muscular overload occurs between about 60 to 70% of one's 1 repetition max. So we follow the 3 approaches that apply to muscle overload. We either increase the load or resistance. We can also manipulate the number of repetitions you do in a set, and we can also increase the speed of the muscle action. So that's moving either concentrically or eccentrically depending on your training. So those are 3 things that we can manipulate to apply muscular overload. Again, increasing the load or the weight, changing the reps. We can also change the sets, the speed of the muscle action as well. Another guiding principle is this force-velocity relationship, and this is that the absolute or peak force generated in the movement depends on the speed of the muscle lengthening and shortening. And we understand that muscles shorten and lengthen at different maximum velocities depending on the load placed on them. We know that maximum shortened velocity decreases as the load increases, and then the muscle force generating capacity rapidly declines with increased shortening velocity. And that's what you can see here in this particular slide or this picture. And a lot of this picture makes sense because if you're looking at the bicep curl that's taking place in the picture right here on the left-hand side at the bottom, this is the eccentric action, the lengthening, the returning the weight back down. And when you hit that kind of midway point right here, this is where you really have to control that weight so you don't just simply drop it to return to that eccentric or that elongated state. So this kind of represents right here the maximum isometric force that can be applied according to this particular movement. In regards to the power-velocity relationship, what you see here illustrates the inverted U relationship between a muscle's maximum power output and limb movement speed during a concentric muscle action. And peak power rapidly increases with increasing velocity to a region of peak velocity. And after that, maximal power output decreases because of reduced maximum force at faster movement speeds. Each muscle group has an optimum movement speed to produce maximum power. And similar to the force-velocity relationship, greater peak power to any movement velocity occurs in fast-twitch muscle fibers than in slow-twitch fibers. The total work accomplished by muscle action really depends on the load or the resistance that's placed on the muscle. One can perform high reps with light loads, but only few repetitions with near maximal loads. And this is shown for you on this particular slide here for the full range of percentages of 1 RM. The area from 60 to 100% represents the strength training zone, and this is the overload stimulus that optimizes strength improvement. Two strength testing approaches determine whether true gender differences exist in muscular strength. The first one is the assessment of absolute strength, which is the total force that's exerted. The second one is the assessment of relative strength, which is the force exerted related to body mass, fat-free mass, or muscle cross-sectional area. So let's talk about absolute muscle strength first. Comparisons of muscular strength on an absolute score basis, such as total force, whether it's pounds or kilograms, reveal that men possess considerably greater strength than women for all muscle groups tested. So women score about 50% lower than men for upper body strength and about 30% lower for lower body strength. This gender disparity exists independent of the measuring device and generally coincides with gender-related difference in muscle mass distribution. Exceptions usually emerge for strength-trained female track and field athletes, and also bodybuilders who have strength-trained for many years for national and international competitions, but that isn't typical. There's actually a really good table in your book, table 14.3, that gives you the strength ratios for different muscle groups. Specifically, they take the female strength score divided by the male strength score in order to get the ratio. And this data represents averages from research literature based on strength scores of men and women for concentric and eccentric muscle actions. Overall, the typical woman's total body strength represents 64% of a typical man's strength. For upper body strength, women average 56% of the men's score, and lower body strength averages 72% of the values achieved by men. In regards to relative muscle strength, human skeletal muscle fiber in vitro generate 16 to 30 newtons maximal force per square centimeter of muscle cross-sectional area. And this refers to a cross-section of the largest diameter of an intact, contracted muscle, regardless of gender. In the body, force output capacity varies depending on the bony levers arrangement and also the muscle architecture. If you look in your books, figure 19.4 shows you the results of a classic study that compared arm flexor strength of men and women related to muscle cross-sectional area. And I flip forward a slide so you can see the study that I was referring to. A strong linear positive relationship of an R value at 0.95 indicates individuals with larger muscle cross-sectional area generate the greatest muscular force, and inversely, those with smaller muscle cross-sectional area generate the lowest force. And this is true for the entire range of force outputs from the lowest to the highest scores. An inset graph shows equality in strength between genders when expressing arm flexor strength per unit of muscle cross-sectional area. Relative strength computes by relating strength to one of the three variables: body mass, total fat-free mass or segmental fat-free mass, and then again muscle cross-sectional area. A relative score increases the fairness when comparing two individual strength performances, or the same person assessed before, during, and after a training regimen, or even after a weight loss program. The next section discusses resistance training for children. And this has gained popularity over the past 2 decades, but the benefits and possible risks remain kind of a good place for further research to take place. A couple issues. We've got incomplete skeletal development in young children and adolescents, and this raises concerns about the potential for bone and joint injury with heavy muscular overload. One could even question whether resistance training improves strength at a relatively young age, because the hormonal profile continues to develop, particularly for tissue-building hormones, testosterone, and growth hormone as well. However, closely supervised resistance training programs using concentric-only muscle actions with high reps and low resistance improve children's muscular strength without adverse effects on bone or muscle. And this consensus does exist among healthcare and fitness professional organizations, listing from the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American College of Sports Medicine, and the American Orthopedic Society for Sports, as well as the NSCA, which is the National Strength and Conditioning Association. These organizations would not come together and make that statement if there wasn't plenty of research to back that up. So what this means is that a child or adolescent can participate in a supervised strength training program as long as it adheres to established training guidelines and precautions that are safe and effective. So what you see at the bottom is this slide are some precautions and some guidelines that individuals should follow according to age and what is best for the child at that particular age. Keeping in mind, again, ladies and gentlemen, that this must be supervised by an educated professional that understands proper planning and programming for resistance training. And I've also listed for you some position stands from the professional organizations that kind of addresses maybe some of the fallacies that are out there and their stance on youth and resistance training. Check those out if you have time. You will have to go to the PowerPoint within the course Blackboard shell in order to be able to click and locate those, unless you want to type all that stuff out, which I don't think you want to, but you can if you want. The next part of the chapter goes over the training systems. And so this is what I was referring to earlier in regards to different things that you can use to develop muscular strength. So they're different, but they're interrelated systems, so we're going to take some time to go over each of these. So let's talk about static training first, or isometric training. So this is when we are operating maximum voluntary actions that produce greater gains in isometric strength than these submaximal actions. So this is when the duration of the muscle activation directly relates to increases in isometric strength. One daily isometric action does not increase isometric strength as effectively as repeated training bouts or repeated actions. It is also important to note that it doesn't provide a consistent stimulus for muscular hypertrophy, and gains in isometric strength occur predominantly at the joint angle used during training. So what is isometric training, now that you understand some of these concepts? So if you could imagine simply contracting your muscles without actually moving your limb for example, your arm, if you just set it out on your desk and then just contract it as hard as you can, that's considered static training or isometric contraction taking place. You haven't changed the length of your muscles, but you are generating a force. So this is comparable to like performing a plank. If you've ever been on the ground and you've held a push-up position for an extended period of time, there's no movement taking place, very similar to a wall sit. So it did gain popularity over a 10-year period way back in the 1950s. Some drawbacks is that it's difficulty in really monitoring the exercise intensity and also training results. Because essentially there's no external movement that occurs during the muscle action, and then it becomes very difficult to determine objectively if a person's strength actually improves and whether the person applies an appropriate overload force during training. But there are some benefits because it can effectively improve the strength of a particular muscle or group of muscles when the applied isometric force covers 4 or 5 joint angles through a range of motion. So isometric training can work well in orthopedic and physical therapy applications that isolate strengthening movements during rehabilitation. So some of you are probably thinking, why would I do planks? Why would I do a wall sit? Why would I sit at my desk and simply contract my muscle in my arm? And usually, if we have an athlete that's coming back from an injury or they're participating in physical therapy, these particular actions might be the only thing that they can participate in because maybe they're immobilized and motion is limited. Also, isometric measurement pinpoints an area of muscle weakness, and isometric training strengthens muscles at an appropriate joint angle in the designated range of motion. So those are listed for you. The limitations and benefits are listed for you here. And a couple more examples for you. Pilates could be an example of static training, and same as suspension training. So if you've ever been to even a Pilates studio and they've got the suspension tables, those are a form of isometric training as well. Another very popular method of strength training is the dynamic constant external resistance training. This is what you typically think of when you lift concentrically and lower eccentrically weights through both of those phases with repetitions. So using either barbells or dumbbells or even exercise machines that feature different muscular overload particular strategies. So that's kind of the most popular form. You've also got variable resistance training up here. You also have progressive resistance exercise. All of these different types of trainings have variations of the number of sets and reps, including the number of rests that's involved. That also take into consideration frequency and intensity, are all proven successful for different individuals based on the practical applications of overload principle. And so this is kind of where professionals will begin to program their resistance training exercise from day in and day out. And there's a couple different guidelines based on research findings that talk about the preferred or the ideal number of sets and reps for optimal strength improvement. And there's about 13 of them listed out for you on page 453 of your textbook. So it talks about if you're going for hypertrophy, if you're going for strength, if you're going for power, how many reps, sets, total volume you should be working for. It tells you that rest for 3 minutes between sets of an exercise at moderate movement velocity is effective. So I would take an opportunity to read those 6 particular training guidelines as they come from the American College of Sports Medicine, and it talks about progression models on resistance training for healthy adults. It actually can be downloaded for free from the ACSM and their website. So here's some responses of the different genders in regards to the dynamic constant external resistance training, otherwise known as lifting weights. Women typically achieve higher percentage of strength improvement than men, but there is considerable overlap between sex comparisons, as you can see here. There's relatively equality in trainability between men and women with short duration resistance training. The next type of training is the isokinetic training. And this differs markedly from isometrics and the DCER because it uses a muscle action performed in constant angular limb velocity. So unlike the dynamic resistance exercise, isokinetic exercise does not require a specified initial resistance. Rather, the isokinetic device controls the movement velocity. And the muscles exert maximal force as they shorten in a concentric action throughout the range of motion at a specific velocity. Advocates of isokinetic training argue that exerting maximal force through the full range of motion actually optimizes strength development. Also, concentric-only actions minimize the potential for muscle and joint injury and pain frequently noted from high force generated within a movement's eccentric component. So if you want, you can type in the video and it kind of talks to you a little bit more about isokinetic resistance training. Experiments using isokinetic exercise explored the force-velocity relationship in various exercises and related this to the muscle's fiber type composition. This particular slide shows you the progressive decline in concentric peak torque output with increasing angular velocity of knee extensor muscles in two groups that differed in sports training and muscle fiber composition. For movements at 180 degrees, elite Swedish track and field sprinters and jumper power athletes achieved higher torque per kilogram of body mass than competition walkers and cross-country endurance runners. At this angular velocity, maximal torque equaled about 55% of their maximal isometric force. And the athlete's muscle fiber composition distinguishes the two curves that you see here. At zero velocity shortening, which is an isometric action, the same peak force per unit body mass occurred for athletes with relatively high or low percentages of fast twitch muscle fibers. This indicated that maximal isometric knee extension activated both fast and slow twitch motor units. Increasing movement velocity produced greater torque by individuals with a higher percentage of fast twitch fibers. And more than likely, fast twitch muscle fibers favor performance in power activities where torque generation at rapid movement velocities often dictates success. Plyometric training, which is otherwise known as explosive jump training, this is a rapid stretching of the muscle followed by a shortening of a muscle group during the dynamic movement. And the basic principle for all jumping and all other plyometric exercises, absorb the shock with the arms or the legs and then immediately contracts the muscle. So if you've ever done box jumps, if you've ever been forced to hop side to side or maybe through a speed ladder, these would be basic plyometric training concepts. Plyometrics avoid the disadvantage of having to decelerate a mass in the latter part of a range of motion during a fast movement. And the benefit to that is that it provides for maximum power production in the activity itself. So what you can see here is a box jump being performed. So what you can see is that a loading stage where your starting position is feet and shoulder width apart. You flex your knees, ankles, hips, and you thrust vigorously forward and upward to land with both feet in the box. So that's that preloading movement that occurs in order to get yourself to stage 2, which is landing on the box safely and not scraping your shins on that corner of the box on the way down. And by the way, that's one of the reasons that CrossFitters wear socks. Yes, part of the barbell scraping up your shins is another reason why CrossFitters will tend to wear really high socks up to their knees, but it's also to avoid scraping when you miss your box jumps. But stage 2, you can see that after landing you're absorbing that impact, and then stage 3 then is jumping from the box, and actually upon landing, plyometrics will actually have that particular individual explode upward again and then onto another box. Or if that type of equipment isn't as readily available, then maybe bounding as far forward before jumping in again. So it could be a series of repeated box jumps to in progression if you're able to have multiple boxes lined out in front of the athlete, or if you simply have one box and you're having them do repeated jumps where they step off the box and repeat the movement again. You can also do box jumps where you jump from side to side over the box, as you can see down here in picture B. Cone hops, hurdle hops, long box jumps are also different movements that can be performed as plyometric training. And these are good for sports that require powerful propulsive movements. So sports like football, volleyball, sprinting, high jump, long jump. Athletes can apply this special form of exercise training in conjunction with their normal resistance training and cardiovascular programming. Again, the exercises repeatedly stretch and load the muscles suddenly and then immediately activate them. And they usually require jumps, rebounding, or drop jumps from a preset height. And this mobilizes the stretch recoil characteristic of our skeletal muscle, and also the modulation via the stretch or the myotactic reflex. There have been new developments in plyometric style training components that are considered ballistic resistance training, allowing an athlete to develop greater power at the end of a movement more closely simulates the projection phase of throwing a ball, or implement maximal effort in jumping movements or impact in striking movements. So in regards to a ballistic training movement, the person will move the weight or projectile as fast as possible with good form while trying to generate the maximal force before releasing it. So sports performance examples can include shot put and a throw-in for on the sidelines for soccer, maybe a javelin and a discus throw. So how do we train that if we're talking about moving weight? This slide is talking about the comparison of traditional bench press versus a ballistic bench press. And this is actually comparing what you guys have known in the past about what a bench press is, but then being able to perform the same bench press movement, but when we're talking about the lowering phase of the bar, instead of simply trying to press up, and when that movement slows down because our arms are straightened at that point, in a ballistic bench press, athletes are actually able to throw the weight up, and there's actually technology that's been developed so that the bench press machine will catch the bar after it's thrown and return it back and re-rack the weight. And so the results of comparing those two types of movements were unequivocal. And during a bench press, deceleration of the movement begins at 60% of the bar position relative to the total movement distance that you can see here, which is the orange line. In contrast with the ballistic bench press, velocity during the bench throw, which is the yellow line, continues to increase throughout the range of motion and remains higher at all bar positions following the movements. So if you guys can think about just simply performing a normal bench press assessment where you lower the bar and return it to its height, you have to slow down because you have to actually control that bar because it's going to stop. In a ballistic bench press, you're actually allowed to throw the weight above your head with the assistance, of course, of the machine catching that weight, but it allows you greater velocity through the movement, which is much more sport specific and can lead to improved performance on the sports field. So this translates to greater than average plyometric force, average power, and peak power output. So again, if you access this particular PowerPoint, I've loaded 2 YouTube videos at the top of this slide that can kind of give you good examples of what I'm discussing in regards to a ballistic bench throw. There's also body weight loaded training. These are also known as closed kinetic chain exercises because typically the distal proximity does not move. This particular method has gained popularity as another modality to strengthen muscles, but also to activate neurocontrol mechanisms to support this type of training. So the example that you see here is body weight supported push-up exercise where the arms in the sling don't contract. don't connect to the surface of the floor, and they actually bear the person's body weight. And what this does is it activates the agonist and antagonist muscles around the joint, including additional muscle groups along the kinetic chain that you can see present here. And while the individual performs the maneuver, the added component of instability further changes the trunk and back muscle neuromuscular control mechanisms. And so there's a lot of fine-tuning of movements that take place while you're holding this particular position. Individuals who are normally used to doing regular push-ups on a flat surface can find this way of supporting the body during a push-up maneuver a very difficult task because the hands could begin to wobble. Some individuals may not be able to hold the starting position, let alone complete a full range of muscle actions. So for them, starting the push-up with the knees on the ground often serves as a lead-up to eventually completing the exercise without knee support. And the role of adding perturbation during relatively simple or complex movements can play this role in training the intricate signal patterns that control the basics of human movement. Core training, this is also referred to as lumbar stabilization, core strengthening, dynamic stabilization, neural spine control, a whole bunch of different names for it. It's actually become part of many athletes' training regimen. So the concept considers the core as a four-sided muscular frame with abdominal muscles in the front, the paraspinalis and the gluteals in the back, the diaphragm at the top, and the pelvic floor and the hip girdle musculature framing out the bottom. And by the way, the core does not simply refer to muscles that cross the midsection of the body to form us and give us a six-pack, which is what we see in social media, magazine advertisements, TV ads, all of that. The core region specifically includes 29 pairs of muscles that hold the trunk steady, in addition to balancing and stabilizing the bony structures of the spine, pelvis, thorax, and other areas activated during most movements. Without adequate strength and balance, the totality of these spine frame structures would become mechanically unstable, and a properly functioning core provides appropriate distribution of forces along the muscle joint bone axis for optimum movement and efficiency. Also adequate absorption of ground impact forces, and the absence of excessive compressive, translational, and shearing forces on joints along the kinetic chain that also must support the body weight. When considering the specificity of strength training response, we have to keep in mind that the muscle strength and enlarged by what we would consider normal resistance training, it doesn't demonstrate equal improvement in force capacity that's measured isometrically or even isokinetically. So this is why it's important to keep in mind that we need to train our muscles and movements that mimic whatever movement is required according to the sport or required of the competition. So for coaches, the focus of resistance training should be on the force that's created, the velocity, which includes speed, and the power requirements rather than just isolated muscle actions. This is why coaches need to incorporate Olympic-style movements in the weight room and not just simply sticking someone on a leg curl or a leg press machine. Sports involves speed and power production based on how fast you can move. So that's why it's very important to incorporate force, velocity, and power requirements according to the specific sport or even position within the sport. So resistance training specificity and strength improvements blend two adaptations in two areas. We make sure that we focus on muscle fiber and connective tissue that harness specific muscles or specific muscle or muscles, and we also keep in mind the neural organization and excitability of motor units that power these discrete voluntary movement patterns. So we want to address large muscle groups, but we also need to fine-tune smaller muscle groups and even individual muscles in order to make sure that we have the large motor patterns that are required as well as these smaller fine-tuned motor patterns that are present. The next component of Part 1 for Chapter 14 addresses periodization. So this is the concept of planning for strength training or training planning. It's become incorporated in the training regimens of novice and even champion athletes. Conceptually, periodization varies training intensity and volume to ensure optimal conditions so that peak performance coincides with major competitions. Periodization for resistance training subdivides a specific resistance training period for 1 year, and this is referred to as a macrocycle, and it chunks it into smaller periods or phases known as mesocycles. And then with each mesocycle, we again separate them into weekly microcycles. So a plan over an annual competition, so 1 year, would be one macrocycle, split into smaller phases of mesocycles, and those would be split even further again into microcycles. So in essence, the training model progressively decreases training volume and increases intensity as program duration progresses to maximize newly acquired improvements in muscular strength and power. One of the good things about periodization is that it allows for manipulation of training intensity, volumes, frequency, sets, reps, rest, all with the goal of peaking performance, but also to prevent overtraining. And it provides a variety. It can reduce negative overtraining or staleness effects in athletes. And your book actually does a really good job of showing you some concepts and some pictures that gives you a general idea of the design for periodization and a typical macrocycle's 4 distinct phases. As competition approaches, training volume usually decreases and training intensity concurrently increases. So these are the 4 different phases of a periodization. The first one is the preparation phase, and this emphasizes modest strength development with high volume. Low intensity workouts, so this is where we'll see someone train between 3 to 5 sets and maybe do 8 to 12 reps, typically at 50 to 80% of their 1 repetition max. They'll also perform some sort of flexibility, aerobic, and anaerobic training within this time period. The next is the first transition phase, and this emphasizes strength development. So this is typically referred to as the strength phase. And again, there's moderate volume, 3 to 5 sets, 5 to 6 reps. There's also moderate intensity. So the second period is strength development with moderate volume, moderate intensity. Again, 80 to 90% of the 1 repetition max. Flexibility is usually always incorporated in each of the period sections. The third phase is then the competition phase, and this is where kind of the sports performance dominates, and resistance training is still present, but it kind of takes a back seat for the peak competition season to take place. So there's selective strength development, which emphasizes low volume, high intensity workouts. So we're still working between 3 to 5 sets, but you'll notice that the volume has changed to only doing 2 to 4 repetitions. But you'll notice that there's very intense workouts working between 90 to 95% of someone's 1 RM. This is also an appropriate period for interval training that really kind of emphasizes sport-specific exercises. The final mesocycle then is known as your active recovery, or your second transition. And this emphasizes recreational activity associated with low intensity workouts that incorporate different exercise modes. So typically this is a player's off season where they're encouraged to go participate in ballet. They're encouraged to go do water sports, maybe join their Y and get into the pool a little bit. And this is for the purpose of preventing overtraining or overreaching and avoiding injury and staleness in performance. And then the athlete repeats the periodization cycle and planning again for the next competition. So this particular periodization structure looks at an inverse relationship between training volume and intensity through the actual competition phase. And then it decreases both aspects during the second transition of the recuperation period. Note the increase in time devoted to technique and training as competition approaches, with training volume at the periodization cycle's lowest point. And again, This is a great picture because it shows you the different mesocycles. It also shows you the different intensities and the volume and load, and what's increased as far as active rest and when the athlete is supposed to peak. And by the way, sports-specific training principles, and I'll go back to this, sports-specific training principles usually apply in periodization when designing a training regimen based on a sport's distinct strength or power or endurance requirements. A detailed analysis of a sport's metabolic and technical requirements frames the entire training paradigm. The concept of periodization makes intuitive sense, yet few studies really present conclusive evidence for the superiority of this training approach. There are confounding factors, and there's difficulty controlling for differences in training intensities and volumes. It is critical, but it is something that's very commonly used in resistance training in order to prevent staleness and to allow peaking to occur at the right time during a season. The last two portions of this particular section for Chapter 14 discusses practical recommendations for initiating a resistance training program, but also resistance training guidelines for sedentary individuals, individuals that may not have previously lifted weights before, or maybe even considering cardiac patients or elderly individuals. So in regards to just general guidelines for initiating a resistance training program, always avoid doing any sort of maximum lifts in the beginning stages of training. Those really should be reserved for experienced athletes, experienced individuals, to avoid any type of possible injury. We always want to start individuals with lighter resistance, that's less weight, and more repetitions at the start of training. And after about the 2 to 3 week mark, we can decrease the number of repetitions to between 6 to 8. So a lot of times we'll start with even 10 to 15 repetitions at a very light weight, and then after about 3 weeks of training, we'll decrease the repetitions to 6 to 8, and then add more resistance or more weight after reaching some sort of target repetition number. We also want to consider training sequence. So that means that we want to work our larger muscle groups first and then smaller muscle groups second in order to avoid fatigue of the smaller muscles that might be required for just simply good posture. So that's why we would want to train the large muscle groups first. If you can also incorporate multi-joint exercises like doing lunges, you're not just simply isolating one particular muscle group. So we look to work many muscle groups initially, the larger muscle groups first, and then we worry about our distal proximities. In regards to competitive athletes, we want them to focus on, again, optimizing strength, power, and hypertrophy, typically with high intensity, anywhere from 1 to 6 repetitions. Middle-aged older adults, what we're focusing on is maintenance, hopefully trying to increase our muscle and our bone mass as well as our muscular strength and endurance, really to just enhance overall health. So typically our competitive athletes are individuals that are a little bit younger, not always. We've seen professional athletes into their 30s for sure, but they're the ones that really need to focus on the strength, the power, the speed, and really building that lean muscle mass. Middle-aged individuals, again, are looking at doing maintenance in order to promote overall health. Cardiac patients are a little bit different. Their job is to focus on strength maintenance to minimize musculoskeletal injuries, maybe from sedentary behavior, or maybe being forced into being sedentary because they've had a cardiac event and they're scared, or they haven't been properly coached in how much physical activity can really aid in their recovery. Okay, so this particular part in the slide then moves on to part 2 of the chapter in regards to adaptations to resistance training. Both acute responses and chronic adaptations occur within resistance training. An acute response is an immediate change in the muscle or other cells and tissues or systems during or immediately following a single exercise bout. Adaptations also refer to how the body adjusts to a repeated chronic stimulus.